We'll do some quick work here.
So what happened is, so 64 came out in 2014 and did well, and then Chris and I had this conversation in the second. Folks actually were suggesting that they might be kind of cool to have a book about Statehood. So, yeah, it was a lot. I learned so much. I have to admit, 89 was a little more challenging in the sense there's so much stuff. 64 felt like it was I did. I spent some time here, I'll be honest with you, watching through newspapers or just archives. So, for example, we have all the Indian feature reports available online through the University of Wisconsin, the Historical Society. So, I could literally read. Yeah, it's just an amazing experience. It was cool. But it got me all fired up about a couple of topics. I do. I love it. I love it. He's a character of the first order. Absolutely. Oh, it's massive. Awesome. No, it's a great, great thing. Yeah, Billings is booming, isn't it? It's just expanding or exploding west. Yeah. Seven. You raised our little guys there, yeah. So that was got a chance to do a lot of my research writing anyway. Parents were mountains and travel. So we love it. Oh, absolutely.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's straight up noon, so we can get started. Thank you for being here. It's a nice crowd for a nice cold Wednesday afternoon. My name is Kirby Lambert, and I'm with the Outreach and Interpretation Program here at the Historical Society. And it is my pleasure to introduce Ken Egan, who is a long time been a good friend of the Historical Society, as well, of course, as of Humanities in Montana. Since 2009, he's been the director of Humanities Montana in Missoula. He earned his BA in English at the university, his MA and PhD in American Literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He taught English at Middlebury College, Rocky Mountain College, and Drury University. He served as divisional and departmental chair at Rocky College and Drury, and sat on the board of Humanities Montana, which was then Montana Committee for the Humanities, and from God, he's really old, yeah, from 1989 to 1992. He is a member of the Federation of State Humanities Councils, Board of Directors, and his books, in addition to the one you're going to be hearing about today, include Montana 1864, Hope and Dread in Montana Literature, and Writers Under the Rims, a Yellowstone County Anthology. So I give you Ken Egan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It truly is good to be here. I apologize. If I'm getting a double mic, let me know. Can you hear me okay? Or good. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here. I love the Historical Society. So obviously, I'm with Humanities Montana, and one of my joys when I travel around the state is to recognize current and former board members, and there are many in the room today. So I'm just going to mention, we have Bruce Wittenberg, who served on the board for 8 years as a governor's appointee. Welcome, Bruce. We have Sidney Armstrong, who served on the board as a representative from Helena. Did I see Bonnie Bowler? Bonnie from Helena, thank you. You served on the board as well. And a current board member, Mandy Smoker-Broadus, is right here with us. And thanks to them for all their service to Montana, and I appreciate it. Yeah. It really is an honor to be presenting on Statehood Day, in part because I'm a Montana kid. I was born in Polson, Montana, many years ago. I'm not going to cite an exact date. There are a lot of dates in this presentation. That's one I'm going to exclude. But nonetheless, it does mean a lot. And my most recent project, of course, is about the year of Montana becoming a state. The way the presentation is going to work, I'm going to have a kind of before and after effect, meaning I'm going to talk about certain events and individuals in 1864 and then fast forward them to 1889. The goal being to tell the story of this place's transformation through the lives of these individuals. We are celebrating 45 years of Humanities Montana. We began in 1972. So one reason I actually produced this book, Montana 1889, hey Kathleen. One reason I produced this book, and it's Hal Stearns, another former board member. Hey Hal, how you doing? I've been acknowledging former board members and current board members. But anyway, and so one reason I produced the book is in fact to commemorate our 45 years of service to this state. And the beauty of the situation is, these of course are the two books, and if you purchase a copy, all royalties go to support the programs and grants of Humanities Montana all over the state. And it occurs to me some of you may not even know what the heck Humanities Montana is. So let me tell you very briefly. We're an independent nonprofit organization. Our headquarters are in Missoula, but we truly are statewide. And our mission is to serve the state of Montana. So we place an emphasis on providing programs and grants in rural Montana, in reservation communities. And so if you were to purchase a copy, those royalties would go to assure more opportunities all over the state of Montana. So since it is Statehood Day, I thought I would begin the talk with a curious quotation. This is a quotation from, in fact, 1889. I won't give the source yet. I'll give the source later in the talk. I want to read the quote. I know it's dense. It's a dense slide, right? But I want to read that full quote. I want you to have that stored up in your mind as we're talking through some of the very interesting characters we'll meet. So the quote reads that the announcement of realized statehood was received by every citizen of Montana with a sense of joy is a fact that needs no defending. That with the feeling of rejoicing, there is mingled a sentiment of regret. Okay, one clue here. This is written and published a day after November 8th, 1889. So already we're talking about a sentiment of regret over the unhappy complications involving peace and good order among the people is a truth that need not be recited. That a plot to steal the new state and pervert the popular will has made itself dangerous by mere force of self-assertion is admitted. That the patriotic people of Montana will resist the insidious assaults of crime is as certain as is the conviction that its people love liberty and prize the blessings which follow Montana's welcome as the 41st star in the galaxy of states. What the heck is going on? This is the day after our Statehood Day, 1889. Well, think about it. Let's see if we can figure that out together as we move forward. So as I say, the talk is going to proceed as a kind of before and after presentation in which I talk about certain events and individuals in 64 and then fast forward to 89. So to kind of establish a baseline, if you will, these are just some kind of salient facts, just some background information that will contextualize our conversation. So the territory of Montana was signed into existence by Abraham Lincoln, of course, on May 26, 1864. The white population of Montana had swelled from fewer than 1,000 in 1861 to over 20,000 by the mid-1860s. And of course, you know what's driving that. It's gold, right? It is the gold rush. And it's also the Civil War, which is the drumbeat, the subtext, the undertow, if you will, for the entire history we're about to pursue together. So just keep that Civil War in mind as we move forward. By the way, historians tell us, and I have to thank the Historical Society, it was their staff that gave me this statistic. Historians estimate that there was probably about a similar number of indigenous peoples in the region in the mid-1860s. So imagine the traumatic impact of that. You go from a 20-to-1 ratio to equity. And of course, many of the immigrants, as we're going to learn, were not the gentlest of souls. So imagine the impact on this place and your people. Several key communities that are very much part of our lives were founded in 1864. So we have Bozeman, Butte, Helena, and Missoula all begin their existence in that year. They're either keyed to the gold rush itself or they become trading centers primarily, right? That is, they are mining the miners. The task in a town like a Bozeman or Missoula really is to provide the goods and services. Thus, someone like a John Bozeman doesn't have to do the hard work of actually mining. He simply, as it were, mines the miners. I like to end my summary of 1864 with the Fort Benton story because it's a darn good one. So in 1864, July 4, we have an account from William Gladstone, who was the great-grandfather of our own Jack Gladstone. But William Gladstone tells us that on the streets of Fort Benton on July 4, 1864, it was hell upon earth. And what he's talking about is he claims there are thousands of people, men mainly, on the streets, drunk out of their minds, using various weapons in order to attack each other. What would you speculate is the source of most of that conflict? Why are these men attacking each other on Independence Day, 1864? Civil War, exactly. They're actually participating in the Civil War in Fort Benton in 1864. That gives you the flavor of the times, I think. And again, think about those 20,000 immigrants, not all of them the gentlest of souls. And then we fast forward and we come to the state of Montana, which of course was created on November 8, 1889. The population, interestingly, by 1890 is 142,924 to be exact. So a pretty dramatic increase over 25 years. You probably know one of the key stories in Montana history is why did it take so long to get from territory to state? And it caused great resentment, of course, in this area. And I'll touch on that history, that story, as we go through together, move together. Founding of these communities now by 1889. And so we had the core four from 64, and you start adding Great Falls, Billings, Red Lodge, Glasgow, and many other communities, largely through the extension of the mining interests across the state, the need for resources such as timber and coal by the mining industry centered in Butte. Also, of course, the arrival of the railroads, right? Both the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern, and we have to bring the Union Pacific up from the south. So, and again, that will be part of our story today, is how these communities emerge. And probably most importantly, honestly, is the creation of these reservations, primarily through the Sweetgrass Treaty of 1888. So you have to imagine that the territory between the Missouri and the Canadian border was by treaty, the Lame Bull Treaty of 1855, that was called the Blackfeet Reserve. And so in the Sweetgrass Treaty of 88, they take and they contract all that space, steal it, let's say it for what it is, steal that space, and they create these small parcels, which are of course along what we call the High Line, so Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, and the Blackfeet Reservation. You also have the Northern Cheyenne Reservation that's created by a special presidential order in '84, okay? So many, many changes going forward. This then is just a map that and this would be the 1889 map. And what I would highlight, if I'm doing that correctly, oops, pardon me, I did not do that correctly. Top button, there we go, okay. Up, I'll go back, apologies here. Okay, top button. So what I would highlight are these communities out here. And what we're seeing then obviously are the emergence of these ranching communities, these railroad communities, and mining communities. So Red Lodge, believe it or not, they're actually extending a railroad down to Red Lodge to draw the coal out of there in '89. So you can see how the state is emerging and how immigrants now are expanding reach and impact as we go forward. So to begin to tell stories from Montana 1889, I'm going to begin with this individual. And it may seem peculiar. We're looking at the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is located within the borders of South Dakota, and that may seem a curious place to begin. But Young Man Afraid of His Horses is an extraordinary man, and in fact had a very important role in 1864, believe it or not. In 1864, he participates in a major battle called the Battle of Arrow Creek, which is near today's Pryor, Montana. And he, of course, is fighting on the Lakota side. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho had come together in 1864 to hit the Apsalica or Crow people. Why? Why is this alliance going hard at the Crow? They're competing for resources. They're competing for land. They're competing for access to bison, primarily, in 1864. They're doing that because they're being forced west by the incursion of the Americans, right? In 1864, for example, there was a major battle in North Dakota led by General Sully, actually Dakota, led by General Sully, those kinds of actions, those military incursions are forcing the Lakota west. So they have a major battle. Young Man Afraid of His Horses participates in that battle. He's in fact kind of a key assistant, if you will, for Crazy Horse. 1864, he is a primary combatant attacking the Apsalica or Crow people. Listen to this letter now, fast forwarding to January of 1889. This is a letter that Young Man Afraid of His Horses dictates to General Crook. And here's what it reads. I want to visit the Crows and plan with them for the protection of our people. So 1864, assaulting, attacking, trying to defeat. 1889, I want to visit the Crows and plan with them for the protection of our people. For the white man is crowding us and will want to crowd us still more. Having become as one nation related to each other, the former enemies will talk of things that are of interest and what is best for our common welfare. He pleads his case by pointing out, I have relatives among the Crows by the marriage of my aunt. They gave me 3 horses and I want to get them. This is an extraordinary moment, and it's revelatory because what we discover when we go back to 1889 is that despite, I think, a kind of common impression that Indian peoples, indigenous folks were sort of, as it were, hunkered down, depressed, demoralized, you actually witness a lot of interchange among the tribal nations going on. In fact, one of the agents, you can access the agents' reports from 1889 online. It's extraordinary. I was just visiting with Brian about this. But one of the agents up at Fort Peck complains bitterly. He says, many of the Indians are going off on freaks, he calls them, leaving the reservation in order to share information and frankly, kind of gain not just information, but also probably morale boost. So very important as we go forward together to think about that. I don't want you to imagine that somehow Indigenous people are living in this state of total demoralization, but instead are taking action, if you will, to defend themselves, to learn from each other. We move forward to Plenty Coups, who is, of course, one of the most familiar, one of the most iconic of pre-reservation Indian leaders, who then continues long into the reservation period. And he's an extraordinary man. He also was at the Battle of Arrow Creek, and in fact has left behind a wonderful description which is captured in the As Told to Frank Linderman book you're probably familiar with, Plenty Coups, Chief of the Crows. So he was there, and of course, as he reports, from his point of view, the Crow were victorious that day, and that seems to be, by the way, a consensus. What about by 1889? He leaves behind one of the most haunting descriptions of reservation life, and this also is captured in the Linderman book. I have not told you, Frank Linderman, half that happened when I was young. I can think back and tell you much more of war and horse stealing. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. There was little singing anywhere. Besides, you know that part of my life as well as I do, because Linderman had gotten to know Plenty Coups. You saw what happened to us when the buffalo went away. So a heartbreaking story, a heartbreaking version of reservation existence. And yet, as you probably know, Plenty Coups was one of the most effective, most determined, I would say most creative leaders in the reservation period. He took a lot of heat for it. For example, Plenty Coups in 1887 had resisted an armed rebellion by a remarkable man named Swordbearer. And I don't know how many people know this story. I tell it in 1889, the book. But Swordbearer led a militant revolt that included visions of the white people disappearing, the bison returning, and the Crow people returning to glory. Well, Plenty Coups actually resisted that. And so that complicates our understanding of his stance, his status on the reservation. At the same time, he is using as much guile, means, as much, frankly, political acumen in order to retain, to sustain the Crow land. And you have to understand the pressure on the Crow reservation is massive. You primarily have ranchers coming in who want to take that land to graze their cattle. You have the mining interests that want to get in there. You have the railroad interests. So Plenty Coups has to find the means to resist that kind of takeover. And of course, he leans on the great dream he had as a young man, which again is recounted in Linderman's book. The dream of Plenty Coups means that the white men will take and hold this country, and that their spotted buffalo will cover the plains. He was told to think for himself, to listen, to learn to avoid disaster by the experiences of others. He was advised to develop his body, but not to forget his mind. The meaning of his dream is plain to me. This is an elder recounting the dream. I see its warning. The tribes who have fought the white man have all been beaten, wiped out. By listening as the chickadee listens, chickadee is his power animal, his spirit helper. By listening as the chickadee listens, we may escape and keep our lands. One historian has used a pretty remarkable phrase. He has said that Plenty Coups, acting on that vision during the reservation years, experienced, enacted what this historian calls a radical hope. A radical hope, and radical means at the root. It also suggests thinking in deep time, long term. And so that is Plenty Coups as aging leader of the Crows. We're going to shift gears now, and we're going to turn to the emigrant population. And inevitably, when we think about 1889, we think about none other than Granville Stewart. I have to admit, for me as, frankly, an amateur historian, and probably at this moment I should confess, guys, that I was trained as a literary scholar. History for me has been an avocation, a kind of private joy almost. For me, I see my work as, I hope, providing a gateway to true history, real history. So I hope that my anecdotes, my stories will lead you to folks like Brian Chovers and Kirby Lambert and others in the room who are true historians. But for me, discovering the Montana past, this man became particularly interesting. Granville Stewart, I love the photo on the left. That, of course, is Stewart in 1864. The photo was taken in Deer Lodge, Montana. You may well know that Granville and James, the older brother, arrived in what became Montana in 1857, fell desperately in love with the place, and let's be honest, they saw opportunity too. They came here and they said, wow, maybe this is where we can make our fortune. In 1864, Granville is actually running a store, the Dance and Stewart store in Virginia City. His brother James makes an expedition into the Bighorn country, right? So they go into the Yellowstone River Valley, they go to the Bighorn. Well, it doesn't turn out. That expedition fails largely because snow prevented them from traveling as they had hoped to. It was the second successive failure, by the way. James had tried a similar expedition in '63 and it hadn't worked. So in 1864, Granville is frustrated. He feels as though that fortune he had counted on, he had expected, he anticipated, it's not happening, and he's demoralized. What about Stewart by 1889? First of all, I love this photo. Many of you will recognize it. This is the great L.A. Huffman photo. He knew Huffman well, by the way. Stewart seemed to know everybody, and I think it's a spectacular portrait of an aging man. I think it reveals a lot about Stewart, though. I think it shows he really, to me, was more of a dreamer, a schemer, a planner, a thinker. I don't think he was so much of a doer, as we'll discover in a moment. So in 1889, where do we find Granville Stewart? He's living on the DHS Ranch near Lewistown, right? The Davis Hauser Stewart Ranch near Lewistown. He's already been dismissed as superintendent of the ranch. You may not know that. By 1889, he's already been kind of fired, to be honest with you, as the superintendent of the ranch. Why is he on a ranch in central Montana, though? He's participating in this so-called cattle boom, this kind of cattle boost, if you will. And so the extension of that immigrant culture now out of the mining camps in western Montana onto the central plains, onto the eastern plains. He's very much a part of that, and it's that age-old American dream of get rich quick, right? So just to give you the flavor of what motivated Stewart to go to the ranch, this is a quote from one of my favorite books. Many of you may have read it, The Beef Bonanza, or How to Get Rich on the Plains, published in 1881. And here's a key quote from that book by James Brisbane. Montana has undoubtedly the best grazing grounds in America. The Yellowstone, Bighorn, Tongue River, and Powder River regions contain the maximum of advantages to the cattle grower. Except on the upper Yellowstone, few herds are yet located in eastern Montana, but in the future, the O'Connors, Kings, Kennedys, Hitsons, and Chisholms of the West will be found on the Yellowstone, Bighorn, and Powder River countries of Montana. And honestly, if you know the story of someone like Nanny and Walt Alderson, if you know that story, this dream infected people. Hey, if you know, honestly, the story of Evelyn Cameron, it's in a sense the similar story, right? It's that dream that you go, you place the cattle on the land, you fatten them up, you run them to the railroad line, you get rich. And of course, it didn't work out that way. So Granville turned out to be a mediocre ranch manager at best. But in 1889, he is suffering from deep loss. His wonderful wife, Albany, a Shoshone woman who spoke both English and Shoshone fluently, she has passed away after producing 11 children, living children with him. She's gone. The eldest daughter, Katie, passes away unexpectedly, and she'd been expected to be, as it were, the surrogate mother. So Granville's in mourning, and what he does is he turns to a young white woman, Belle Brown, who, shall I say, had a checkered or mixed history or reputation. She had served as a school teacher on the ranch in prior years, and Granville turns to her and marries her in 1889, 1890. So his life is changing. He will leave the ranch. He'll go on to actually an extraordinary career. He'll be an ambassador. He'll be a librarian in Butte. But in 1889, his fortunes are definitely on the decline, if you will. And I promised I'd mention Wilbur Sanders today. Anybody know his famous kind of nickname? He was a famous dude, Wilbur Sanders. He had a famous nickname. He was called Montana's Mephistopheles. So those who don't know, Mephistopheles is the devil tempter in the play Dr. Faustus, right? He's the one who tempts Faustus to damnation. And I find that a great, fascinating name. It's also just colorful and fun to say. But in a sense, I think it's his dark looks, perhaps. There's this sort of, but more than that, he was a die-hard, unreconstructed, radical Republican, right? So we're going back to the Civil War years now, right? He was a die-hard Republican who never relented on his belief in the Republican cause. So the photo on the left captures the young Wilbur Sanders. So he arrives in Montana Territory, actually prior to Montana Territory. He arrives in September of 1863, comes into Bannock with his uncle Sidney Edgerton, and guess who leads him into Bannock? Someone famous from vigilante days, someone who might have been sheriff of Bannock. Yes, Henry Plummer, right? Yes. So Henry Plummer leads Wilbur and Sidney into Bannock in September of 1863. They actually have Thanksgiving together in 1863. But come a very bleak, cold day in Bannock, January 10th, 1864, Wilbur Sanders stands aside as Henry Plummer is strung up, right, as he's hanged in a very cold-blooded fashion. There's actually a famous story, which I hope is true. Sounds almost too good to be true, but I'm hoping it's true. But the story is that the vigilante mob is dragging Plummer by Wilbur Sanders' cabin in Bannock. And so Henry reaches out and he pleads to Wilbur, "Stop this madness, save me, sir. We just had Thanksgiving together." And according to legend, Wilbur says, "Henry, you can't feel worse about this than I, but there's nothing I can do." Yeah, me too. I'm very skeptical that Henry didn't feel worse about the situation than Wilbur Sanders. Very tough man. He ran to be Montana's first territorial representative, right? Once it becomes a territory in May of 1864, they have to elect a non-voting representative to Congress. He runs as an ardent, and I have to say, very aggressive Republican. No holds barred, right? He does not cotton to, he has no patience for Confederate-leaning, Copperheadish, Southern sympathetic people. He loses badly, frankly, to one Samuel McLean. I bet you've never heard of Samuel McLean, who is a Democrat, and that sets the pattern for his whole adult life. Wilbur's goal will be to get to Congress as Montana's territorial representative. He will not succeed. However, remember that quote we started with about some weird nefarious doings at Montana's statehood and some kind of treachery and all that? We're going to come back to Wilbur when we get to that full story. One final point about Wilbur Sanders. I admire him immensely. He's probably most famous because now there's many historians believe he was behind the murder of Thomas Marr. And so I know Wilbur Sanders has taken on a very dark cast, and part of the Montana Mephistopheles reputation goes to that. I admire him immensely. He, for example, defended Chinese in Butte who were assaulted by many labor unions, right, in an attempt to shut down Chinese competition. He defended them and in fact was quite successful in a couple of cases. As we'll learn later, he became a kind of surrogate father to Helen Clarke. So he tended to look out for those who were oppressed, who were what we now might refer to as the minority. So, Bud and Clara McAdoo. Anybody heard of these guys? I'm curious. How many have heard? Well, our historians, of course. And I have to acknowledge Martha Cole. One of the joys of making a book like this is that you learn so much from so many good people. And truly, I know you read acknowledgments and it sounds like we're making it up or being nice. We're not. We can't do this. Writers can't do it without a heck of a lot of help. It's truly a kind of collective enterprise. And Martha was so helpful in a number of ways. One of the ways is she helped me to locate really interesting, important female leaders from 1889. And so I just want to acknowledge Martha. Anyway, so Bud and Clara McAdoo, they're a lot of fun. I recommend them highly. I feature them in my July chapter. So if you choose to buy the book, Montana 1889, or for that matter 1864, fair warning, the way the stories are told, they're told month by month. And so you have a series of kind of interlocking stories. And so these characters kind of reemerge time and again, as you'll see. Anyway, so Bud is a classic early Montana settler. He gets here in 1861. It's actually Perry McAdoo. Arrives in 1861. He makes some pretty good money from the mining. And then he migrates to Bozeman. That is the town of Bozeman. So he works with John Bozeman on creating that town that's going to mine the miners, basically provide goods and services, etc. Bud's interesting because he helps to found the very, very first flour mill in the Gallatin Valley. His partner in that is Tom Cover. The reason that's interesting is some of you may know Thomas Cover probably murdered John Bozeman. So there's this kind of interesting connection there. May have. So, but Bud, the reason he's so interesting is he makes the leap across the divide, across the Bozeman Pass into the Yellowstone Basin in the late 1870s. Bud is always looking for the next best opportunity, much as Granville Stewart was, right? So he makes that leap into the Yellowstone Basin. He establishes his base of operation around what was the town of Colson, near the current town of Billings. And it's a very simple kind of calculus. I mean, it's not complicated. He sees this open terrain. The railroad, the Northern Pacific, is following the Yellowstone, so he figures communities are going to be strung like a necklace along the Yellowstone. They're going to need supplies. He's aware that the Crow Reservation and the emerging Northern Cheyenne Reservation, they will need supplies. So he wants to get there early and first, right? So he establishes himself there in the Yellowstone Valley. Clara McAdoo arrives with her husband from Michigan, her poor husband, who's apparently suffering from lung ailments. You probably know this, but many people came from the upper Midwest to Montana for basically the dry climate, consumption, tuberculosis. So anyway, they moved from Michigan to the Colson Billings area, and it turns out Clara is really, really clever. Really clever. And so among other things, she starts buying up town lots. You might well know Colson is eclipsed by Billings, right? Because Frederick Billings, all right, decides he's going to establish a community and make a lot of money off it. Anyway, so she very cleverly gets in on the ground floor of the real estate business in Billings. She also serves as a kind of manager clerk for the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was notoriously badly run. So she provides this kind of financial and managerial acumen, right? So she's part of that. But the real breakthrough for her is Bud learns about a mine up in Maiden, Montana, near Lewistown, up in the Judith Mountains. It's a gold mine. And he is struggling with health issues. He has paralysis. She takes over as manager of the Spotted Horse Mine. Turns out to be brilliant at it. She's apparently, by all accounts, brilliant at it. So Clara becomes the manager of this very lucrative mine. They get rich together. All seems to be going well. And by the way, I have to underline, because Martha taught me this, Clara is also important at the Constitutional Convention that's taking place here in Helena in July and August of 1889. She is advocating for women's suffrage. And it actually gets pretty close. I believe they come within 5 votes of getting women's suffrage into the Constitution. And Clara gets a lot of credit for that. Sadly, she and Bud, though, are destined to be split. Turns out Bud had engaged in an affair. The affair becomes public when his former mistress claims Bud had promised her a whole lot of money. So to demonstrate or validate or authenticate the relationship, she releases 140 letters between them into the public record during a trial in Miles City. Clara, who's become fabulously wealthy from the Spotted Horse, decides she doesn't need Bud anymore. She goes back to Michigan, builds a gorgeous house, and the rest is history, as they say. So that's now we turn to another familiar couple. If any of you have read 1864, you know about James and Pamelia Fergus. In August of 1864, Pamelia, and do some of you know the opera Pamelia by any chance? Do you know? Yeah, very good. And I've heard a rumor, by the way, that they're going to restage the opera in Billings in the next year. So keep your eyes and ears open for that. Anyway, so Pamelia, the reason I mentioned it, of course, it tells the story of this incredible couple. So in August of 1864, Pamelia brings their 4 children to Virginia City. Why is James in Virginia City? He had come west in the early 1860s to try to find money in order to underwrite or capitalize a community in Minnesota, Little Falls, Minnesota. Well, that didn't pan out, but he establishes himself in Virginia City. Pamelia brings the children with her. They cross the plains on the Oregon Trail, and they take what's called the Bridger Cutoff on the western side of the Bighorn Mountains, and they land in Virginia City. And it's tempting to assume that all ended well, that all culminated in a kind of happy reunion, etc. But it turns out things didn't turn out so well initially. So I want to share with you, this is a letter that James wrote to Pamelia, and the oddity of the letter is he wrote it, they're living together at the time. He writes the letter and apparently hand delivers it to her. And I think you'll see why. I think you'll get it. So here's a letter. I think it reflects their kind of psychological and marital condition here. Mrs. Fergus, I have not had an opportunity to give you my private opinion of the disgraceful scene that took place before Mr. Gilpatrick Thomas Dillon and your own family at dinner one day last week, in which you made use of such language as never fails to disgrace, or at the very least lower a female in the estimation of all respectable people. Profane language is allowable to men by common custom, but when used by a woman, it is generally allowed that she only has to add drinking, and then she is prepared to become a public woman. I bet you know what that means. They are the only women whom everybody expects to hear swear, and even some of them have never stooped so low. So, some incidents occurred at a dinner early in their reunion in Virginia City. It has triggered Pamelia to swear in company. It then causes James to write this letter, and believe me, guys, this letter goes on and on and on. I'm giving you a very small excerpt. So he's totally obsessed. He's totally upset. Can you guess what she had done at the dinner to the food to cause this eruption of anger, of this sense of bereavement, or not bereavement, but hurt and all that? What did she do to the food to cause this eruption? Nope. Good guess, but no. Put too much salt on it. Yes, she put too much salt on the food. And so it just suggests to us that when they come together in 1864, they have a lot of work to do to become a companionable, loving couple once again. So we fast forward to 1889, and in truth, in 1889, James is mourning the death of Pamelia. She had passed away in 1887 after a long life together, but he's still mourning her, as we know from his letters and his articles, etc. By the way, just a quick aside, none other than Wilbur Sanders delivered the eulogy at Pamelia's funeral. That's largely because Fergus was another diehard Republican. So, in any case, as he's thinking back on his relationship with Pamelia, they have moved across the divide. They too have gone into ranching big. They are now living on Armel's Creek, not far from the DHS ranch. So they are neighbors, actually, of Granville Stewart. And he's very close to Stewart, although their politics are at variance. And at one point, James writes a very moving letter about how he and Pamelia had come together to establish that companionable marriage. Here's what James wrote. Our children being all married, but Andrew helped him run the ranch. He's seldom at home, and me an invalid. We were always together and thought far more of each other than we did when we were young. I think people of good sense generally do. Having lived so long together, they become so used to each other's ways, become more like each other, are more forgiving, and one becomes, as it were, a necessity to the other. I know it was so with us. Very moving. And now, a turn to a really heartbreaking moment in 1889. Once again, we have that before and after effect. The photo on the left is an extraordinary photo of Victor, who's chief of the Bitterroot Salish. It was taken in 1864. And as you probably know, Victor helped negotiate a key treaty in 1855, which we now call the Council Groves Treaty. And in that treaty, Victor exercises incredible, I think, kind of patience and just intuitiveness and insistence by saying that he will not move his people out of the Bitterroot Valley. Instead, the President of the United States must do a thorough survey of the valley, and they're going to negotiate ownership of the valley. And of course, the person who's negotiating that treaty, Isaac Stevens, he is incredibly impatient. He just wants to settle this. Why? His goal is to run roads and railroads through that country. He just wants to figure out an arrangement whereby he can control space. The Americans can control that space. But Victor is stubborn. He's insistent. Well, his son Charlo had managed to hold on to that valley until November of 1889. And then a heartbreaking decision, and I'll use his words. By the way, as often as possible, I aim to use the words, the expression of Indigenous peoples. It is their story to tell. And I'm basically a visitor. I'm someone who wants to make folks aware of those stories, but it is their story to tell. So these are the words of Charlo in November of 1889. I will go, I and my children. My young men are becoming bad. They have no place to hunt. My women are hungry. For their sake I will go. I do not want the land you promise. That is the land, now they're moving, of course, up into the Jocko Valley. I do not believe in your promises. All I want is enough ground for my grave. We will go over there. Heartbreaking decision. And as we learn from a variety of documents, including Peter Ronan's agent report, they are in very bad shape in the Bitterroot. A severe drought, which is, by the way, a theme of 1889, severe drought covers the state, and it's affecting many ranchers and, of course, native peoples as well. Severe drought. Charlo himself believes that his young men are being turned to bad ways, so he chooses to move them, not chooses, he determines that they must move north. Now, the backstory here is that Charlo had participated in earlier negotiations. In 1872, James Garfield, later President of the United States, comes as an Ohio congressman, and his task is similar to Isaac Stevens back in 1855. The task is to somehow compel, convince these native peoples to move so that the Bitterroot Valley is completely open to white settlement. Well, of course, Charlo refuses, right? He says, no, I'm not going to do it. However, other chiefs, such as Arlee, choose to make that move. And this leads to a very bitter statement by Charlo. You may carry me to Fort Missoula dead, but you will never carry me there alive. I heard before that your great father had printed a book showing my name to the Treaty of 1872, but I never signed nor told anybody else to sign it for me. As to carrying me to the fort like a bag of grain, you did not talk that way when your people were going to California and came through my country sick and hungry. I had many warriors then and could have killed them all, but we nursed and fed them and did all we could to make them happy. Nearly all my warriors are dead now, and I have only women and children. You have your foot on my head now, but then I had my foot on your head. There is not a drop of white blood on the hands of my people. I have no faith in what you say now, for the government has broken all the promises made by your great father in 1855. So they do make that move, but it's actually 2 years later. Just to me, add insult to injury and to compound the pain, right? They're not able to move for 2 more years, which means that they continue to suffer starvation and deprivation in the Bitterroot Valley. When they make that move, a Salish woman who's a girl at the time, Marianne Coups, says, everyone was in tears, even the men, and the procession was similar to a funeral march. Let me move forward then to Helen Clarke. I mentioned her earlier, and great to see you. I mentioned her earlier. She's an extraordinary woman. She's the daughter of Malcolm Clarke, who was a fur trader for the American Fur Company, and Coco Na, who was a Piegan woman, and in fact, arguably a kind of a royalty among the Blackfeet people. She had an extraordinary life in the sense that her parents, primarily Malcolm, chose to send her to the upper Midwest, primarily to St. Paul, in order to get her education there. He wanted her to have an elite education. And she returns to Montana, sadly, in time to see her father murdered in 1869 by Owl Child, who's a relative of Coco Na. At that point, Helen Clarke leaves Montana. She actually becomes a famous actress for a little while. One of my great regrets, you have regrets as a researcher, most of the materials about her life as an actress have been lost to fire, to lost records, etc. So that's kind of a loss for us. She returns to Montana initially to teach in Fort Benton, and then Wilbur Sanders and his wife say, come to Helena, live with us. She comes to Helena, she becomes the superintendent of instruction, believe it or not, in Lewis and Clark County, an extraordinary thing. But she suffers tremendous prejudice as a mixed-race person. Helen Clarke came to call the age in which she lived the age of tribes, by which she meant that there was a sorting going on, a segregation, an insistence that people should not mix, right? And so here is a letter written by a mother. Okay, it's Lizzie Fisk, for those of you who know Lizzie. Here's a letter Lizzie Fisk wrote about Helen Clarke. I do not intend sending Grace and Robbie, her 2 children, to school again this winter. Excuse me. I have long been dissatisfied with the school. Mr. Howie, the principal, is an excellent Christian man. Grace's teacher, Miss Clarke, is a half-breed Indian, the daughter of Malcolm Clarke, who you perhaps remember was killed by the Indians nearly 11 years ago. Miss C was educated in a convent and is avowedly Catholic, but she has no faith in God or man. She hates the school, hates her work. While I am sorry for her, she is not the person I would choose as an instructor of my children. Very tough stuff in 1880. So she leaves in December of 1889. She takes 2 nephews back to Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, and then she goes on to become an allotment agent, believe it or not. And we don't have time to go into allotment in depth today, but that's an extraordinary move for her. And so that is Helen Clarke, another key figure. And so now, to bring our story of 1864 to 1889 to an end, inevitably, I got to turn to these characters, right? So you, of course, recognize them. We got Wilbur Sanders. We got William Andrews Clarke on the left. We have Marcus Daly on the right. And, of course, Clarke was here in 1864. You may not know that. He arrived early. He arrived in Montana in 1862, what would become Montana. And he begins building his fortune very early on. I mean, whatever you think about William Clarke, and it's easy to say a lot of bad things about him, he was an incredible businessman, right? So he begins building his fortune. Along comes this Daly, arriving in the 1870s. And I'm going to argue that 1889 is the very year when their conflict becomes inevitable, when the Battle of the Copper Kings emerges in full force. We get kind of a sense of that, actually, because Daly writes a letter to Samuel Hauser in January of 1889. And Daly's letter reads, "To tell you the truth, I am so disappointed and so disgusted that I have now quit politics for good." I have now quit politics. This is actually in January of 1889. What is causing Daly to say that? Well, basically, Daly had colluded, maybe an unfortunate word. Anyway, Daly had colluded with certain key players like A.B. Hammond out of Missoula to defeat Clarke in the last election for a territorial representative. Remember, that's a big deal for folks. They want to be the last territorial representative because then presumably they get to be a U.S. senator when Montana becomes a state. Well, those two, Daly and Hammond, collude to prevent the election of William Clarke, and he knows it. It's not hard to figure out. You just look at where the voting took place and who voted Republican, right? I should explain these are both Democrats. And lo and behold, it turns out that Daly and Hammond were extremely worried the federal government was going to bring suit against them for illegal timbering practices on reservation lands in the public domain. And lo and behold, they choose to back a Republican non-entity in order to try to protect themselves from prosecution. Well, it does lead to the bitterest, of course, of fights. Here is here's William Andrews Clarke when he figures out what's going on. The conspiracy was a gigantic one, well planned and well carried out, even though it did involve the violation of some of the most sacred confidences. However, as you suggest, he's writing here to Martin McGuinness, however, as you suggest, the day of retribution may come when treason may be considered odious. And so arguably that is the start of the Great War of the Copper Kings. So now we come back to that quote. This is published, now disclosed, this was published in the Anaconda Standard, November 9th, 1889. And so the day after the people of Montana vote to become a state by an overwhelming margin, there should be joy, great joy. And instead, the Anaconda Standard, which is, by the way, Marcus Daly's paper, it's Democratic, this is what they're saying. And you have to ask, what could have gone wrong? Well, doesn't it always go back to Butte? It always goes back to Silver Bowl County. So the results out of Silver Bowl County, electing the first formal state legislature, the results were so confusing, so apparently illegal. Anyway, they end up seating 2 legislatures. The very first Montana legislature, you end up with 2 separate houses, one Democratic and one Republican. And they each, at this time, right, they're the ones who nominate people for the Senate. So they end up with 2 different slates. So the Republicans nominate none other than Wilbur Sanders and Tom Power, a big force out of Fort Benton, and the Democrats nominate William Andrews Clarke and Martin McGinnis. And so the Anaconda Standard, which backs Democrats, right, is all over this saying, look at the potential, the way they're going to steal those Senate seats from us, those dirty Republicans. They're going to go ahead and nominate those Republicans. Just a quick aside here, I want to point out, this is Marcus Daly's paper, and he is, in fact, backing William Andrews Clarke for election to the Senate. So I just want to point that out. I think, I'm just speculating, I think this was an effort by Daly to kind of make amends after what happened the year before. Anyway, so you know how this turns out. It turns out that the Republican Congress, the reason Montana did not become a state for 25 years is because the Republicans who dominated the federal government didn't want those crazy Democrats from Montana infecting and influencing the federal government. So anyway, the Republican Senate chooses Tom Power, and chooses Wilbur Sanders, and he finally gets to be a senator, though only for a short time, and only one time, I'm sorry to say. So anyway, that is the story behind the quote. All right, thank you so much for being patient. I just want to let you know about some resources. The website, Montana 1864, has a whole bunch of cool stuff that you can tap into. Please, if you have questions, contact me. I love visiting with folks. I, of course, am happy to sign books, by the way. That's a good thing. And I do have to give full credit. The Montana Historical Society is an extraordinary resource. They're a great partner for all of us. And I got most of the photos you saw in this presentation from right here at the Historical Society. And I'm very, very grateful to them. So thank you. I've left a little time for questions.